record button there. There we go. But this should be Daniel chapter 3, should be a familiar study because we've all heard of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We've heard of the fiery furnace. So between this chapter, Daniel 3, and the chapter that's about Daniel himself being in the lion's den, that's probably two of the most popular and familiar stories in the book of Daniel. But this is just one event of many that's intended to emphasize that God is the ruler of all nations and he is to be honored above all. And I think that's just one of the key points that we're going to learn here from Daniel 3 today. And so let's just outline it. Let's take a look at what we're going to read. In verses 1 through 7, we're going to read about a crisis of faith. And the crisis is that Nebuchadnezzar has decided to set up this statue, and he expects all of the people in his kingdom to bow down before it, especially those who are employed by the kingdom. They are to bow down before it and to worship it. And so this creates a crisis for the Jews who have come to Babylon because they're captives, because they're not to bow down before any image. They're not to practice idolatry. They're not to worship any other God than the one true God. And so they have a choice: do what Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, says, or to do what God, the Most High God, the living and powerful God of all kings, to do what he says. And so there's a crisis here. What we're going to read next is that they are criticized for their faith because they choose not to do what Nebuchadnezzar was commanding and not to honor his request. The fingers begin to be pointed at them. They're not playing along with the group. And so they are criticized for their faith in verses 8 through 12. After that, we see there's a challenge of faith. Nebuchadnezzar comes to them and says, you know what, I'm going to give you another chance. Maybe you didn't understand. I expect you to bow before this image. So let's go ahead. Let's get the band playing again. And let's give you another opportunity to bow down before the image. And so they are challenged by the king himself this time in verses 13 through 15. And even though the king himself makes this request, this is just not something they can honor. And so we see the courage of their faith here in Daniel 3. Doesn't matter how powerful the king is, God is more powerful and he is to be honored above the king. And that's what they tell Nebuchadnezzar. And because of their courage, they are censured. They are told that they are going to have to go into the fiery furnace and they are going to be punished. Nebuchadnezzar had said, if you don't do this, you're going to be punished. And Nebuchadnezzar, no pun intended, had to prove he wasn't blowing smoke when it came to that threat. So when they refuse to do it, he decides he's going to go ahead and put them into the fiery furnace. Their faith is contagious. They encourage one another in their faith, the three men, but also when Nebuchadnezzar sees that they have been thrown into this fire, they have not been touched or harmed by it, he himself begins to have faith in the God they serve. And even though he doesn't, come out and say this is the only God, he does call their God the Most High God. And that's, I think, an important point to make. He's contrasting their God to the other gods that he would be familiar with in paganism and says, you serve the Most High God. And so notice that when we're studying Daniel chapter 3 and when we start reading the text. And then finally, the culmination of their faith is that they are exalted. They are rewarded. And so that's a quick outline of Daniel chapter 3. Let's get into the actual text and read it. Look at Daniel 3, 1 through 3. It says, and this is the New American Standard, Nebuchadnezzar the king made a statue of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar the king also sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the administrators. I believe if you'll count, there's 7 different levels of positions from the Babylonian government that are mentioned in that list. And he says he wants them to come to the dedication of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the administrators of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. All right, so imagine, by the way, the pressure of this situation. Okay, you don't just have the king who's going to be here, but you have various levels of government leadership who are going to gather together and all at one time bow down to this new statue that has been set up. And so if you choose to defy this order, you choose to do this in front of all of the major leaders from that empire. So this is a big deal. This isn't just, this isn't just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with just a few commoners from the city. Okay, these are the cream of the crop in terms of the leaders of the empire. So it says, the herald loudly proclaimed in verses 4-6, to you the command is given, you peoples, nations, and populations of all languages, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. All right, so the herald is proclaiming this the first time. Nebuchadnezzar is going to repeat this command later, specifically to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It says, whoever, though, does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into the middle of a furnace of blazing fire. You don't do what we tell you to do, then you are going to be punished for that. Okay? So it's either you get on board or you're going to get thrown in the fire. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. I want you to notice this picture here that's on your screen, because it's actually something that is from 8th century BC relief that's been found in Turkey. And in our first lesson, when we were introducing the location of the Babylonian Empire, one of the points that we made is that part of that empire is in Turkey, part of it would be in modern day Iraq, part of it would be in Iran, but the Babylonian Empire spread to these areas. But notice there's 4 marching musicians who are entertaining unseen guests at a banquet in 8th century BC relief. And the scene shows, from left to right, it shows 4 instruments. It's got a tambour, 2 types of lyre, and it's got a flute. And so just wanted to point out that these instruments that are mentioned in Daniel chapter 3 were used, and archaeology, I've made this point many times when I talk about archaeology, but there's no archaeological artifact that's ever overturned something in the Bible. Archaeology often proves what we read about in our scriptures, and this is just one small example of that. These would have been common instruments. All right, so what does King Nebuchadnezzar demand that all government officials do? And what's the penalty refusing? We got a nice, easy cupcake softball question to start off here. What does he demand all the government officials do? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to jump in there and answer.
Bow down and worship the king.
Bow down. Yeah, worship the statue that the king has made, right? And what's the penalty for refusing? What happens to you if you refuse?
You're going to die.
You're gonna die. You're gonna die by fire. We're gonna throw you into the fiery furnace. All right. And so that sets up the chapter for us. And take a look at verses 7-12. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do so, and for this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. Some versions actually say malicious charges against the Jews. Okay, so there was a lot of hatred for these men. And they began to speak and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. All right. Very important that you butter up the king a little bit before you make a request of him. So that's what they're doing here. You, O king, have made a decree that every person who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments is to fall down and worship the golden statue. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into the middle of a furnace of blazing fire. All right. So they're repeating to the king, here's your rules. Of course, the king probably knows the rules, but they want to set up these rules because they found some people who didn't follow the rules. They say, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods, nor do they worship the golden statue which you have set up. Now, I've got a couple of questions to ask before we even jump into the real questions. But do you remember what Daniel and his friends did in Daniel chapter 2? Do you remember what they did? They interpreted, right, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Who were some of the people that couldn't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream? Some of these Chaldeans.
Yeah.
So Daniel essentially has saved the life of these men because Nebuchadnezzar wanted them killed, and Daniel pleads for their life and asks their lives to be spared, even though they were false teachers and false prophets. And what do they do in exchange for Daniel's act of kindness? First opportunity they get, they see they've done something wrong, and instead of trying to spare these men, they point out these men, and they want to see these men destroyed. Not a very thankful, not a very good way to reciprocate the kindness that had been given to them. Now, why might they have wanted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gone? What did they mention about these men in verse 12? There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, you think these guys are good guys. You've exalted them. What could be an ulterior motive as to why the Chaldeans want these guys gone? What might it mean for them?
They're jealous, and those three are their bosses. They want to get rid of them.
Yeah, they're jealous. And if we can get rid of them, then we can be in a position, perhaps, we can be promoted into a position of power.
They're outsiders also.
They're outsiders. You're right. They may have been very jealous that here we are, Chaldeans, and you let some people who are Jews, one of the most despised nations, come in here and exalt them to a position? That's not fair. And so what we see here is, I would say, some national strife. We see some corporate jealousy. And I think there's certainly some things that are playing out here that can play out in the real world as well. Carrico said it's a great way to eliminate the competition. And Mary Beth said also in chapter 2, the king had bowed down to Daniel and declared his God, the God of gods and Lord of lords. So good. Chaldeans may not have liked that as well. All right. And so I just want you to notice that, and then we'll jump into our question here. Nebuchadnezzar, he hears what these men have done, and it's been phrased in a way that it can really provoke his anger. Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger, because he's thinking, you're right, I did elevate you. How dare you defy me? You should be doing whatever I ask you to do. So he's mad. He gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar began speaking and said, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden statue that I have set up? And so they're being interrogated. They're kind of brought into the interrogation room here and they're being asked specific questions. Do you not agree with me? Are you not on board with me? You realize I can take your position away? I can throw you in the fiery furnace? They're being threatened. If you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, very well. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in here and he thinks, I'll handle this. All right? They may defy my herald out there in the public square, but these men are going to come into my room in front of me, the king, and defy me. They wouldn't do that. And he says, if you don't worship, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can rescue you from my hands? All right, so let's jump into some of the questions. I saw a couple comments, so I'm going to grab one of those. Carrico said, the real question is, why do you not worship me? That's right, because the king made the God lowercase g. You're right. You're right. Anytime that we want people to respect us beyond what the respect that they would give to God, they're putting themselves in the shoes of God. And that's really what he's angry about. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't willing to give Nebuchadnezzar that kind of honor. All right. So when some of the Chaldeans notice the Jews aren't going to bow down, they bring the accusation to Nebuchadnezzar. And as we have already mentioned, some of the motives might be jealousy, or there's business jealousy. There might be some national strife there, some religious strife, but all those are involved. Can you think of any modern day comparisons where Christians refuse to do something which violates their conscience and it gets blown into a bigger deal than it ought? Can anybody think of any modern day comparisons?
How about the bakery out west that refused to make the cake for the gay couple? Something like that.
Yeah. Here you are, you're a baker, and it violates your conscience to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual couple. So you say, I'm just not going to do that because I don't want to endorse your lifestyle. So I'm not going to do that. And these people try to smear your character. They bring a lawsuit upon you. They try to throw you into court. They want to ruin you. I mean, it could have gone somewhere else, got a cake somewhere else, right? But they want to ruin you. That kind of stuff happens. I know photographers that are concerned about that, where they're in the photography business. And what do I do if someone asks me to take pictures that are inappropriate, or pictures that would endorse a lifestyle that I don't agree with? And so there's some real challenges and questions that we face in our world today because of things like that. Can you think of anything else?
How about the pro-life movement, where you're disdained for standing up for life?
Okay. Sometimes we can be demonized. If you don't agree with abortion, you think that that's murder. Sometimes you can be demonized. You're right. You're taking away a woman's medical services by standing against organizations that support abortion, like Planned Parenthood. Any other things that you might mention?
Hey, Josh,
Uh-huh.
can you hear me?
I can hear
Okay,
you.
how about a Church of Christ preacher that won't marry somebody that has been divorced the wrong way or anything
Mhm.
like that?
Yeah. That can certainly be an area of pressure. Sometimes we can be castigated for that, for just, that's in opposition to our conviction. So we're not going to do that. So that can happen. Let's see. Carrico say, disagreeing with transgender issues, even when it's unfair to women, or family issues over restroom topics. Yeah. All those things. So we could probably think of a lot of issues where there are certain things that we just can't do. We can't participate in out of good conscience. And sometimes when we don't, we're not going along with the crowd, fingers start getting pointed. So this has, I think, real application to real situations today. In this chapter, we see some intense peer pressure, and I think it's asserted through various mechanisms. And I believe these same agents can influence us today as well. What about government? I actually wanted to share a video with you, but I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to pull it off, but I saw a video on, when was this? Monday night, I believe, that was sent to me. This was a preacher in Canada, okay? Preacher in Canada preaching this Sunday. I'm talking like 4 days ago. And this is only a congregation of like 15 or 20 people. He's in the middle of his sermon, and the cops come in the back door and tell him that because they are assembling in the midst of COVID, they are to cease and desist. And if they do not, they could be fined. And the next time he gets caught, he can be put in jail. He's recording this. He actually tells the members, by the way, when he sees the cops in the back, he says, everybody turn your phones on and record it. And he was very polite, but it was obvious he was very shaken because his sermon basically stopped 15 minutes into the sermon, and that's it. And then he's talking on a microphone, and here's what just happened. We're not allowed to meet. If we do, they're going to start arresting people. That's government asserting its power in a way that at some point in time, you might have to make the choice. Do we listen to government, or do we assemble as God tells us to assemble? That's a choice. It's a choice. And sometimes government can crank up the peer pressure. In Canada, by the way, let's throw Canada back out there. It is a hate crime to speak against homosexuality. And so all you can really do is quote a Bible verse, but you have to be very careful how you speak about it, because you can be put in jail for that. And when government starts making laws that criminalize Christian beliefs and behavior, then that's extremely dangerous for us as Christians. And it's the government asserting peer pressure upon us. Sometimes music can be used. Music influences people, and obviously he uses music to influence. Sometimes when we have certain musicians who take our side or our stance, look at all these celebrity musicians. I don't take a lot of, I don't give that a lot of credence, because there's a lot of idiot musicians out there, but sometimes that's a means of peer pressure. Look how many celebrities stand with me, wealthy people. We can use music, we can use celebrity. The enemies of these people of faith, they certainly are influencing. And then, of course, ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar is their employer. And sometimes our employer can ask us to do things that violate our conscience. And at some point in time in life, we might have to face a choice. I've known people who were in the financial sector, and they were asked to lie or to cheat on their numbers for the company's gain. Well, if you're a Christian, that puts you in a pretty big dilemma, because you want to respect your employer, but your employer is asking you to do something that's not respectable. What do? The employer is cranking up the heat on you. They're applying pressure. So that can be a difficult choice to make. Let's take a look. I've answered my own question. Anybody else want to jump in there on any of this? What are some other ways that peer pressure can be applied?
Hey, Josh,
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
if you have a minute, maybe I'd like to share an example.
Sure.
As a school teacher in the district that I've been in for the last 20 some years, there are times when administrators will pressure you to change kids' grades based on certain circumstances in the kids' lives, even if they've totally refused to do the coursework. And they come to various teachers at times, and they pressure you to change the kid's grade to a passing grade because the parents are putting pressure on them. So they come and put pressure on us. And that's happened to me personally. And like you said, it's a lot of pressure. But what I chose to do is I said, if you want to change the grade, you do it, but I'm not going to do it.
Mhm.
And, I don't know why I wanted to share that, but that's kind of an example of holding strong to your values. And, it could cost people their jobs, but if they want to change it, then they can change it. But I told them that I would not change it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as Christians, we're supposed to be people of justice. We believe in being just and fair. We're not supposed to be partial. And when you're showing partiality to a certain child just because of who his parents are or because of pressure, I think that's a good example. It's a good example. When I was in high school, my high school had a really good basketball team. A lot of really good basketball players came out of my high school. There's NBA players now that came out of my high school, and you kind of notice though that some of those basketball players got to skip class and just kind of leave school whenever they wanted, and didn't really show up to class a lot of times and didn't really do the work, and somehow they always got good enough grades that they could keep on playing. That's not fair. It's not fair, and you wonder if there's a little bit of pressure from the coaches and the athletic director to try to cut them a little extra slack. I know not everybody's like that, but I think that's a good example, Keith. Take a look. Let's keep reading. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we are not in need of an answer to give you concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods, nor worship the golden statue that you have set up. Wow. I mean, I read that reply and all I can say is just, wow. I mean, they didn't beat around the bush any. They didn't try to come up with some wimpy excuse. It was just, Nebuchadnezzar, no, we're not going to do what you're asking us to do. That's in opposition to our God. And if our God wants to rescue us, he can. So we'll take the punishment if that's what we have to do, but we're not going to do it. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like that because he thought he could control these guys, and he was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. And these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, their other clothes, and were thrown into the middle of the furnace of blazing fire. Now you would think, right? You got clothes that are very flammable being thrown into the fire. It says, for this reason, because the king's command was harsh and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the middle of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. So how does King Nebuchadnezzar react to this act of rebellion? How does he react?
You could say
He's enraged.
He's enraged, John says. I think of Phil jumping in.
I would say violently and angrily.
Violently, yeah. He's very violent. He's very angry. He's upset. Mark Barry said that's some hardcore faith. Gets hot and he heats up the furnace, right? So yeah, that's how he reacts. I don't want them to just be punished. I want them to be completely annihilated. Nebuchadnezzar's so mad. How dare you defy me? I'm going to make an example out of you. How do the three friends react when they get threatened, when they get intimidated, when they get bullied by Nebuchadnezzar? How do they react? How would you be tempted to react?
I think it's very interesting that they stood with their faith, regardless. They said, regardless if God saves them or not, they're not going to do it. They're going to maintain with their faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good point.
Josh,
Yes.
I'm impressed that they answered his wrath and his anger with just calm assertions of their faith. They never lashed out at him. In their whole speech, they said, we will only do what our God commands, but they never told him, they never called him ugly things. They never said, they never even said, you're wrong, O king.
Mm-hmm.
They just said, our God can save us and will save us if he so chooses. They never act ugly.
I think that's a good point. They don't lower themselves to his standard. And in the end, they end up looking more kingly than he does, because he loses his temper and he loses his cool and he starts saying harsh things and making rough threats. And, some of the verses that we have here below were verses that are intended to indicate that. So Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath. A harsh word stirs up anger. They don't respond to his rage and fury with their own rage and fury. They're very calm and they stay cool in how they respond to him. And so they may very well have been angry at what they were being asked to do, but Ephesians 4 says, be angry and sin not. And I think that's important. In the midst of pressure-filled situations, Christians don't be the ones that crack in that situation. That can end up actually making you look bad. Somebody else want to jump in?
Josh, I was just thinking the king planned this thing to be built and it took a long time to do it. So this is a long time in the making.
Mm-hmm.
And people had to realize what was coming. They made up their minds long before that, what they were going to do if necessary, I figure.
Mm-hmm.
Happened in a couple of days.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You mentioned, how we would react or want to react. You look at the way things are today, or have always been really, but when you're pressured by an outside source, whether it be, for your beliefs or whatever it may be, or, you look at, people being pressured by the government for their beliefs, whatever it may be, what happens is, typically they want to revolt, they want to fight back, right? So you see that in all sorts of countries everywhere, including here. Whether it's just or unjust what's being happened, you might be fighting for a just cause, but we see that that's not the way that we are supposed to behave. That's not the way that we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego behave, right? They respond, cool, calm, and collected, so to speak, just like we see with Jesus as well later on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's a good point, Daniel. Another verse that's up there is 1 Peter 2:17, just says, honor the king. And they do honor King Nebuchadnezzar, so long as King Nebuchadnezzar is not asking them to do something sinful. But even in disobeying him, they're still respectful in how they speak to him. I think that's important. And that's something that I'll just kind of throw out there because I know there is a lot of political drama in the world right now. And it's very important that even though we disagree, that we be civil and that we be respectful in how we speak. And when we start reverting to name calling and speaking out of anger and making, dangerous or intimidating threats, that's not what we see from these people. They don't respond to Nebuchadnezzar's evil with evil. They're very candid. They're straightforward. I don't agree with that. I'm not going to do that. But they're respectful in what they say to him as well. And so there's just really good lessons to learn in how they deal with this type of criticism. Take a look at this is McGuigan's commentary, and he says this. He says, there is a double test here for the three. This was not only a furious tyrant, he was also the one who had honored them by giving them exalted positions. I know it's true from personal experience that it's often harder to oppose one who has been kind to you than the one who's terribly angry with you. Somehow it seems treacherous and ungrateful not to go along with the desire of those to whom we are obligated. Wasn't it Goethe who said, most men can oppose their enemies, but it takes a special person to oppose his friends. And so Nebuchadnezzar had been friendly to them up to this point and actually had exalted them. And so for that reason, sometimes it's harder to say, you know what, you did do some nice things for me. And I don't think they were unappreciative of that, but you're still wrong here. And I'm not going to do that. And so they still stand their ground, even though that must have been a difficult position to be in. All right. Question 5 is this, and this is obviously going to be a part of a lesson like this. We must submit ourselves to every ordinance of man, 1 Peter 2 says, and Romans 13 says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. But what does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego teach us about how we must handle an order from our government which violates our conscience? What do they teach us here?
Well, God comes first.
Mm-hmm.
We obey God rather than man.
Right. God has to come first. So obey men in as much as what they're asking you to do is in accordance with God's will. But if it violates, we have to stand our ground. Carrico said Nebuchadnezzar forgot the guys he put in the fire had found favor before with, in his own words, the God of gods and Lord of kings. It's another example where God wins the battle and God will win the war. So it's a good thought. It's a good point. All right, let's keep moving on here. Before these young faithful Jews could obey God's word, well, they would have needed to know it. So which of the 10 commandments that you find in Exodus 20 would have been violated by honoring the image? Why do they refuse to do this?
The first and second, you shall know the gods before me, and you shall not bow down before an image.
Mm-hmm. No other gods before me, and you shall not bow down before an image. It's very clear and very straightforward. And so they would have known, because they knew the word of God, they would have known it's wrong for us to do this. All right. Take a look, though, at some of the excuses that they could have used. I think this is kind of interesting. And you don't hear any of them, because sometimes these are the things we say when we're looking to get out of doing God's will because we're being pressured. We say things like, well, we're in the minority, so nobody's going to listen to us. We might as well just go along with it because we're in the minority anyway. And if we say anything or if we resist it, it's not going to do any good. They could have said that. They didn't. Or they could have said, well, we're young. A lot of these people are older and they've been a part of this country for longer than we have. And so they're not going to listen to us because we're young. If you know the right thing to do, even though you're young, stand for it. They could have said, we're far from home, right? I mean, Babylon is a long way from Jerusalem. So nobody's going to know if we bow. And sometimes that's what we think. Well, you're at the party, mom's not around, dad's not around, nobody from church is around. Just go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and do what everybody else is doing. You're at school. There's no other kids from church around you at school. Go ahead and just talk the way that they're talking. Go ahead and watch the dirty video or laugh at the dirty joke, because nobody's going to know anyway. If you know it's wrong, doesn't matter if you're far from home or there's nobody else there with you who shares your faith, stand for what's right. Or they could have said everybody else is doing it. And if they looked around at the crowd, most everybody else, except for the three of them, were doing it. Or if we just obey, we'll live a longer life. And so think of all the good things we can do for God later in life if we just obey what Nebuchadnezzar is asking us to do now. And sometimes that's how we reason with ourselves. Well, I'll go ahead and lie for the boss now because I'll keep the job longer and I'll be able to provide for my family. You do the right thing. You do the right thing. Don't right is right now. Don't think, well, I'll do the wrong thing now and then later I'll do a lot of good things and make up for it. That's not how it works. If you know the right thing to do, do it. Or they could have just said, we know it's an idol, so let's just kind of go through the motions, but in our heart, we know we're not really bowing down to this. We're not really honoring it. But what would their actions have said to everybody else? The fact that they would have caved in that moment would have weakened their influence with all the rest of the Chaldeans and would have made the Chaldeans think these guys can be bought. These guys can be pressured. And so do what's right. Do what's right. They don't use any of those excuses. They just do what God wants them to do. So here we get to the end of the chapter. And it says, verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded because he sees that they haven't been burned. And he stood up quickly. He said to his counselors, was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the middle of the fire? They replied to the king, absolutely, O king. He responded, look, I see 4 men untied and walking about in the middle of the fire unharmed. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the middle of the fire. Notice there's 4 different levels of government in verse 27, not all 7. The satraps, prefects, governors, and king's counselors were gathered together and saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had even the smell of fire touched them. I'll tell you, my wife would have really appreciated that because whenever I go to city barbecue, I can't hide it from her, all right? I come home and I smell like a fire pit. And it's the amazing thing about verse 27 is that they are in the middle of the fire and they haven't been even touched by the fire and they don't even smell like fire. All right. So what happens? Well, basically they don't get burned up, but the king's men do. You think that's a little message from God? What causes Nebuchadnezzar to be astonished, though? He sees something in that fire that's a little bit different because he only threw 3 men in there. What does he see?
The fourth looks like a god to him.
Yeah, he says the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And so that's been variously interpreted, variously understood. Some commentators write a whole lot on that. And that was, I think, our next question. Well, maybe that's our last question. So we'll get to that here in a minute. Let's read the last 3 verses. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants who put their trust in him. So by the way, what does Nebuchadnezzar think this is, this 4th person who comes down into?
An angel.
Calls it an angel, yeah. Now, whether it was an angel or not an angel, he thought it was an angel. That's what he calls it. So he said, God has sent his angel and rescued his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and surrendered their bodies rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. So Nebuchadnezzar knew very clearly what these men had chosen to do, and he is now impressed by that. And so he says, now I make a decree that any people, nation, or population of any language that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, their houses made a rubbish heap, because there is no other God who is able to save in this way. And the king made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prosperous in the province of Babylon. Okay. Now, do you remember what the king had said to the disobedient Jews about their God in verse 15. Remember the question he asks at the end of the verse. Take a look at verse 15. And he says, "Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Get the feeling that's kind of arrogantly stated, right? Who is the God that is going to deliver you? When I throw you into the furnace, you're going to get burned up. And no God is going to deliver you. And yet, when you get to the end of the chapter, his belief has changed by the time we get to verses 28 through 30. Okay. And his belief has changed because he says there is no other God who could deliver but their own God. And so we see Nebuchadnezzar being corrected. And you know what? Sometimes there's a great lesson here. Even kings can be wrong. Even prideful and arrogant and very self-confident and cocky people, they can be corrected. And humbly, he has to basically say, I stand corrected. I was wrong. There is a God who can deliver, and it's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yep.
So, Josh, a lot of times when we think of the miracles, we think of New Testament miracles. This is clearly a miracle, and surely showing the power of God working directly in these people's lives. But a lot of times when we think miracles, we just think in Christ time or in New Testament times, but these are things that are happening. What's that?
Somebody else had said something, I'm not sure who.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's amazing how you see the power of God coming out. So it's amazing to sit back and watch something like this because they've never seen nothing like this in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, good point. These young men are willing to sacrifice their bodies as they serve the God of Israel. They're willing to be burned up. So does that remind you of any New Testament passages? Can you think of any New Testament passages that call us to be willing to sacrifice our bodies?
I was thinking about 1 Corinthians 13:3.
Okay. You can go ahead and read it.
To it here. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Okay.
All right. So clearly there's something good about being willing to sacrifice your body, but Paul's actually using that as a contrast here that, if I don't have love, even though I've made a tremendous sacrifice, it still won't profit me anything. So that's a good one. Any other ones? The one that I think of is Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So God says you've got to be willing to use your bodies to serve him, whether they be wearing our bodies out in serving and helping others, or wearing our minds out, or perhaps even be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of Christ. Fox's Book of Martyrs it's a very sad book, but when you read about it and you start reading about all the various sacrifices that Christians in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century made in order to serve God and to not bow down to the pressure that they faced from the Roman Empire, it is incredibly, it's just encouraging to see their courage and what they're willing to do to make the ultimate sacrifice out of loyalty to God. Mark Barry says that he would have been the most powerful person on earth. Right. Nebuchadnezzar would have been. and yet God was greater. Take a look at this quote. I've got a couple more quotes here, and we'll be done here in just a minute. But McGuigan says this: very often in life itself, it's only through the fire that we find freedom. How we long for holiness without pain, sanctification without a cross, and growth without tears. How we resist the dying. We'll promise anything just so long as our will can be permitted to live. But of course, Jesus says if we lose our life, we'll find it. And so we've got to be willing to be sacrificed for the sake of God, be willing to suffer. I like this poem, which is actually going to be in the bulletin this Sunday, because I just think it's interesting. It says, sometimes with secret pride I sigh to think, how tolerant am I? Then wonder, which is mine, tolerance or a rubber spine? And I think one of the things that you can say about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't have a rubber spine. These guys are tough. These guys, certainly in living in a pagan land, there's certain things that they just couldn't avoid seeing and being around. And so there's an importance to tolerance, but tolerance has its limit. When we're asked to tolerate in the sense of endorsing or approving things that we think are sinful, then that's asking too much. And they're not willing to do that. We see their courage here. I'm not going to get into this particular question because we're about out of time. All I'm going to simply say is there's some people who say, well, this was Christ making an appearance in Daniel chapter 3. I don't know really how you can definitively prove that. That's just conjecture. Well, it was an angel. Well, Nebuchadnezzar thought it was an angel. Maybe it was an angel. I've even had people say somehow Daniel appeared. We don't really know. We know that he saw a fourth person. Good guess, I think, might be that it was indeed an angel who's comforting them, but we don't really know. All right, so preachable lessons, and we're done. Here's my lessons that I would take from Daniel chapter 3. There has to be a limit to what the godly will tolerate, regardless of the consequences. Right? Tolerance has to have its limits. And if we're being asked to tolerate things that are sinful and approve of those things, then there has to be a limit. We have to obey God rather than men. So there's going to be times that ungodly men ask us to do things that aren't necessarily wrong, so we do them. But when ungodly men ask us to do things that are ungodly, then we've got to do what God's will is. Third lesson, if we'll walk through the fire with God, he can give us the victory. Take a stand, be courageous. You might find that God can really work something out in a very positive way, and you never for a minute thought that he could do it. So be courageous. Good things can happen when we stand up for what's right. And of course, the final lesson, and the lesson that I think is one of the key lessons in Daniel, is that there's no other God can deliver like this. And that's a lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned, and that the God of Israel was the living and true God, the true God who could deliver. That statue that they were worshiping couldn't deliver anything. But God is a living God. He's not something just made of matter. He's a powerful God. So that's a lesson for us that we can be encouraged by. So I leave you with this quote. This will be the last thing I consider with you. These three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now face the test of fire. What Jehovah promised figuratively in Isaiah 43 and verse 2, he demonstrated literally in the three Hebrew children in the fiery furnace of Daniel. And as the saints of New Testament days face the fiery trials of life as Christians, he was with them. So also he will be with us. But this assurance is only for those who face these judgments with a degree of faith and conviction possessed and demonstrated by the three of the captivity. That's from Homer Haley's commentary on Daniel. And so it's just an encouragement. Go ahead, take a stand, learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's courage. Okay. Next week, we're studying Daniel chapter 4, where Daniel is going to interpret a second dream. He's already done one in Daniel 2. He's going to do another one here in Daniel chapter 4. By the way, did you notice that Daniel's not mentioned in Daniel chapter 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his friends get, take the chief role in that chapter. All right, if there's nothing else, we're going to be led in prayers. Anybody that would like to lead us in prayer, just go ahead, volunteer. I'll take a volunteer tonight. Anybody would like to close us out with prayer?
I can do it, Josh.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yep. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you so much for this time that we can get together and study your word. We ask that you'd help us look at the examples of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the strength that they had through the persecution that they faced, and look to them as examples through our lives. Be with those that are sick and ailing at this time, and be with us that we continue to focus on your word. We pray this all in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Stop recording here.